White Knight is a talk show with published authors, writers, and content creators discussing both the creative and technical sides of writing, as well as the industry surrounding it, from novels to screenplays to comics and more. And now, here's your host, author Travis I. Sivart.
Welcome to Write Night. We'll get to the topic and discussion in just a moment. For those listening to the podcast, we record the podcast on our live stream at twitch.tv/Travis Tavern Talk, and we have a live interactive chat audience. You might hear the sound of the bell ding, and that means I want to interrupt somebody to read a comment or question. For those on the live stream, we won't read off everything you put in chat, but we'll try to get to the most relevant, the most amusing, or some combination of the both. Now, while we introduce ourselves, go and let us know what you're reading, writing, or creating tonight. And I'm Travis Sivart, and tonight's topic is going to be world building, and I've been world building since I was 6, and I'll get a little bit into that in a few minutes. Couple of books where I've built worlds, really every new series I've written, from Silver and Smith to Portals to The Downfall to Journal of a Stranger and so on. Now let's go to introduce the two, a plethora of world building knowledge between these two gentlemen, between books and role-playing games and comics and just so many other things. Let's start with you, Robert Turk. Introduce yourself, throw some street cred down, pass it over to John when you're done.
Hey folks, I am Robert Turk, author and game designer. I have published 4 role-playing games, a couple card games, over 6 books. Some of them even won awards. You can find my stuff at wicked-clever.com.
I'm John Millington. I'm with Jersey's Cards and Comics, a gaming store here in Virginia. I'm also the CEO for Conquest Publishing. We do comics, role-playing games. You can visit us at conquestuniverse.com, and our new site will be rpggaming.org for our role.
Very good. Now, like I said, I've been world building since I was 6 and got my first Star Wars action figure for my birthday in 1977. 76? When did Star Wars come out? I'm embarrassed. 77, right? Yeah.
77.
Yeah. And I started world building then. And then when I hit my 13th birthday, I was given Dungeons and Dragons, and I began building a brand new world. And since then, with the different books and projects, I just love building worlds. And for me, it's something I feel it's easy. It flows naturally for me most of the time. But apparently, not so for everybody. This can be very challenging or just so daunting that nobody has any idea where to start. And we're going to go to that topic of where to start in just a few minutes. And we'll probably have different views on where to start, and that's okay. This is something you're going to see on Write Night. We all do things in different ways. And it has to be clear. That's okay. That's allowed. John, do you want to start with your world-building background?
Well, obviously, my world building started with comic books.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a wide diversity of worlds and stuff that you're going to write within. Typically, it's Earth. Then later on, role-playing games and stuff became pretty prevalent. And I think all of us have probably had their own home campaign and stuff that they've been running for quite some
right.
time. Now, as a publisher, I mean, we've come up with, a couple guidelines and stuff on world building and where is that going to lead into for eventually publishing and stuff. So we kind of have a plan of action associated with it. But the key thing overall for world building is, where do you want to start your audience at, and focus on that.
We'll get into that in
about how many horses are in that town that they're never going to see.
We'll get in. Hold on, John. Let Robert give his world building background. Then we'll all have a chance to throw out that exact information.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Robert.
And for those of you that are listening audibly and can't see my gestures, I am cheering for John and screaming yes without screaming it into my microphone.
You can go to make that auditory also, within reason.
So world building for me, I was a very imaginative child. I can remember creating, not trying to trump Travis here, I can remember creating imaginary worlds before I was going to school. I don't know what age that was, but when I was little, my dream job was being a Muppet. Okay? So, and I actually kind of ended up achieving that as a professional goblin and puppeteer most recently. But so I've always been creating imaginary worlds, whether that was just to explore, whether that was to escape something, I don't know, but I find it fun. I'm fascinated by the imagination and by coming up with ideas, what if ideas that aren't our reality, telling a good story. So that's where I come at world building. Yeah, I mean, I write role-playing games now for a living, so I've created worlds for role-playing games. I've created worlds for my short stories and novels. I've created, like Dungeons and Dragons worlds for playing with my friends. But for me, it all comes back to embracing your childhood imagination and asking the question, what if? So there you go. Back to you, Travis, I guess.
Well, we could go to me, or
we can go John.
Yeah, John, you started out with, here's how you feel you should start world building. So you're not worried about horses and all their names and who has a chipped hoof. Go on.
Now, and we all discussed our backgrounds and stuff, and when we started particular things, you have to think that I was already in college before D&D kind of got its start. So prior to that, I mean, you immerse yourselves in reading a lot. I mean, and that's what I can always tell people, always read. And that's going to help spark particular ideas and stuff for your world. But as for world building, you have to like whatever the thing is that you're doing. I mean, if you enjoy fantasy, why are you designing a science fiction role-playing game? I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. You're going to have a better craft with stuff that you like, stuff that you can get involved with. As a publicist, though, we have to kind of take more of a formulatic look at things. Is like, at the end of this is what we want to produce. So, like, we want to make 4 books for our first role-playing game for Merger. We want to have the base book and the magic, the science, and the noir books separate that people can engage with. But that's part of planning things out. But as for world building, you start off with your basic. Are you planning it off your novel, or what's the background, or what's the genre of the story? I guess is the key thing to start with.
Okay.
And what are you going to allow people to have in the system?
And Robert?
I think, from my process, I'm out to tell a good story, and I want, whether it's people playing my games, whether it's people reading my books, I want people to be entertained, and like John said, I do a lot of subconscious world building. Like, I know there's authors out there that will sit down and plan out their world. And draw maps, which it's awesome fun.
It is.
Drawing maps. But for me, it's what's the story I want to tell? And then tell that story. And if that story takes place in a school of witchcraft and wizardry, please don't sue us, then you have to know how the magic works, and you have to know who the students are, and you have to know what the school's like. Do you have to know everything about that world? No, not to start writing a good story. And I guarantee she didn't know everything about that world when she started writing that first book.
Right.
That came as she was writing books. So I think that's my biggest thing for, like, I get frustrated sometimes when people tell me, oh, I'm still world building, or I'm thinking about the world. Awesome. Think about that. But world building only goes so far. It's a tool to give, if you're making a role-playing game, to give the people playing your game the information they need to know to exist in this world. If you're writing a book, world building is only there so that you can tell the story you want to tell. If you're doing a movie, world building's there so that you have consistency across your story visually on the screen. You don't have to be God and detail the history of everything. Let me rephrase that. You don't have to be Tolkien and detail the history of everything, unless that's what you're into, unless that's what you want to do.
Unless that's your story.
But that's not necessarily the craft of writing a good story.
And if I can jump in here, my base philosophy is your world is what your characters are experiencing. Whether that's a movie, a book, a role-playing game, whether you're writing your own or playing one that's already created. If your characters are trapped in one room and haven't left it yet, that's the whole world until they leave that room. Then it's that building that they're exploring, or that street, or that city, or those woods, or that cave. Now, you can create outside of that, but you don't have to, except to create the consistency. If you know they're going to start out in this room and later they're going to a cave system and it's a fantasy world and there will be magic, you need to create that sort of stuff, at least the most basic part of it, to have that consistency. So you don't have those flaws of shit that just doesn't fit together. And Kitty has a few comments. Most of my world building happens in my head. A lot of my world building happens as I'm creating the narrative. And that's what I'm saying. I have seen so many writers spend so much time world building, they never even create their first character. Let alone the story and the events that the character is dealing with and interacting with. And this is where I'll often look at a new writer who's like, I'm world building. I'm like, when are you going to write? I realize you're writing about your world, but when are you going to write your story? And that world will grow organically as your characters experience it. And also, if you have your world planned out too much, without even realizing it, you're going to skip over important information that your reader or players or whatever need to get as they grow as a viewer and experience your world.
Yeah. Because I had a thought here. So, role-playing games that are not based on existing properties, like Star Wars role-playing game, great role-playing game, world building's done for them. Although a lot of the Star Wars stuff came out of the first Star Wars role-playing game, which then went into novels, which then went onto the screen because they were working with George Lucas
and
closely.
For clarification, you can absolutely create your own Star Wars world, but you still have that framework already in place. But you can create your brand new planet with even minor differences in laws of physics.
But some of the best role-playing worlds that I can think of still start with their story. One of my favorite medieval fantasy worlds is the world of Midnight, which was essentially, what if Sauron had won the War of the Ring? Now, for copyright reasons, they never mention hobbits or the War of the Ring or anything, but it's essentially the Dark Lord's taken over. But it starts with that story of the world, okay? And then you get into details of, like, if you're going to go to this place, well, this is how they think and how they live. But it all starts with the story. There was another one and I've forgotten it. But the point is that story, even when you're making a role-playing game, it doesn't have to be a novel. Even when you're making a role-playing game, and you need world building for your new role-playing game so people can get inside that world with you to play it. But you still got to start with that story so that
it's true.
Draws the people in.
If you look at all the D&D expansions, and John, did you just raise your hand?
Yeah.
Give me a second. I'll pass it right over to you in a moment here. If you look at all the D&D expansions throughout history, with Greyhawk and then Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance and Eberron and all these others that I can't, it's too numerous to mention, the story is the difference. The setting, which is part of the story. And a few comments here. Wordwin says, to me, the world is a character. Like the other characters, I give it enough for the characters to interact and do interesting things. And all these differences, Ravenloft is another one. And Kitty says, too much world building could unnecessarily hamper the narrative. John, what were you going to say?
So, in fact, what Robert was speaking of, ease of engagement into your game is so important. You should look at when you're writing your role-playing game. This is the prologue for your novel.
Mm-hmm.
Your players have to kind of have a good sense of what it is,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's the discovery of that world as they play in it or explore and find new things to do in it. That's the engagement that you want, but you want an ease of engagement to get them involved to start with.
Now, just for everybody who's listening or watching, John also works on comic books, so he can speak to world building in that also, which is done with art as much as narrative. So don't hesitate to bring that in also, John, because it's across the board. And for writers and authors, that might be that one picture you have, your cover art. That can help your world building. The name of your world can help give a feel or an element, a theme, a atmosphere to your world. Ravenloft definitely gives a different feel from Eberron or Forgotten Realms. They all have very different. Greyhawk gives you more, you feel like, I don't know, castles and knights, whereas Forgotten Realms, there's a little more mystery and mysticism in it. Dragonlance, well, dragons.
And big lances.
That's right.
Well, and in modern times or nowadays, I mean, we're fortunate that we can make movie trailers and here's an introduction to our game. This is the cinematographic version of, hey, this is what Merger's going to be.
Related to that, Wordwing comments, so the new Godzilla vs. Kong movie, the opening credits is an example of some great world building. When I watched this, which by the way, also Godzilla King of Monsters, King Kong, every one of them has the same type of montage credits with the redacted government documents with things blacked out and pictures from the past 50 years or more of different things. And it's, if you stand there and stare at them, it's a fascinating exploration where you can't wait to get that on DVD or Blu-ray so you could pause it and go, I just want to read the 7 words they didn't black out and see what we got there. Yeah. And kudos to whoever put that together, because it's beautiful.
So I was the most recent book that I wrote, Persnickety Jones and the Pirates of Undertow, which has a very unique world to it. Because Persnickety Jones' little brother gets sucked down the bathtub drain, and she has to go rescue him. And it's like, where is he? What is that world down in the sewers? And it's not. Right. It's a little bit scary, but it's a middle grade book, so it's for ages like 8 to 13. So it can't be a horrible poop-filled world. I mean, I guess it could be, but it's not. But when I was writing that book, I sort of developed the world as the character went through it and explored it, because she didn't know what it was like down there going through. So I didn't spend like months before writing that thinking about, well, what does this city look like? What does this corridor look like? What do the boats look like? It was as I'm writing the story, they're riding on a boat most of this. I need to know what that boat looks like. Turns out the boat changes a couple of times on purpose, but I need to know, how are they illuminating things down here? How do they see underground? And she gets to this port, and what makes this town special? Why do the people live here instead of further downstream? So that was the world building that happened, but like somebody else said, it happens during the narrative. One of my most favorite books right now is the Expanse series, which has been turned into a TV show. And the world building in that is great. They are definitely building a new world for you. But I think I think it developed
Yes.
as they're writing,
Yeah.
because they don't have to know how this works until book 3. Now it's important, the story's gone there. Let's figure out how that works, but make sure it's consistent with everything that's come before.
One.
Yeah.
And in your role-playing game design, if you hard set stuff, it's hard for the person that's picking it up to be creative and move on with your story.
Yeah.
I didn't care for the Wheel of Time series is because you always felt like you were a cog in some wheel. You couldn't really change anything.
By the way, same thing for novels. If you hard write every description, it leaves no room for the imagination of the reader. And
Correct.
one of the books I'm reading right now via audiobook is Terry Pratchett, Going Postal, on his Discworld series. Now, I've read a few of the Discworld books, just a few, 2 or 3 years ago, 20, 30 years ago. So I'm kind of reintroduced to this world. And in this, he mentions in passing like the world is flat. He doesn't mention the elephants. He doesn't mention everything under the world. He doesn't mention all these other things because it's not necessary to this story. He mentions the post office. Even when describing the post office, it's not in incredible detail. It's general, enough that you get the feel of it and you fill the rest in the peripheral with this kind of blurry vision of, this is what I picture it like. When the character rides a horse to a new town for just a couple hours, turns around and comes back. That new town, the biggest description is the bathtub the guy is in.
Yep.
It's great. He runs into one building. He doesn't even describe, besides a horse trough outside, not a lot of description, and it's not needed. So don't Tolkien overbalanced, in a lot of people's opinions, with the description. When you're having a 7-day journey, you don't need 7 days of description of the hills and the grass. You can, and some people love it because they're that's how their brain works. And Wordwin says Going Postal is one of their favorites, also a great movie. Isn't it a series on Amazon Prime?
It's like one of those mini-series. It was like 2 or 3 episodes
Okay.
to make the whole movie.
Good enough. I'm looking forward to watching it because I've watched The Watch, and it's a delight.
That's the series.
Delight to see the characters in the books on the screen branching over. It's fun, but I don't want to go into that right now. I want to stick to what we're talking about here. But my point is, here's this super successful writer with minimal description.
Yep.
Even describing the characters. Besides the main character, most of the other characters get a vague once-over so you can fill in the blanks yourself.
Yeah. Well, and Terry Pratchett, I mean, he built a world
Mhm.
over, it's more than 20 books. I
And
don't
then
know the exact
changed
number.
it.
The world does change
Yeah.
in the books,
Yeah.
actually. But I mean, he's got the elements. He introduces them like a book at a time, like the Wizard Academy. When the wizards are important, you got the Wizard Academy. When you've got, I don't remember all the neighborhoods, but like the post office, and then branching out into the other towns, like
Right.
the Gothic vampire town. It's been a while since I read them all, but yeah. So he doesn't sit down and throw it all at you. I mentioned to Travis just last night, I'm not a big fan of steampunk literature. And what it actually is I'm not a big fan of the tendency of steampunk authors to try and explain every damn thing to you.
Right.
Because it takes me out of the story. And there's some good steampunk out there that doesn't do that. They just tell you a story. But I've seen so many that's like, we have to explain how electricity works and how this works and how this works. And we're 3 chapters in and we haven't gotten to a story yet because you're building a world. And that's not why I pick up a book. That's not why I write a book. It's to tell the story.
If I can read Kitty's comment here, another issue with too much detail is getting the details wrong. Any real world thing, even in a fantasy world, there are going to be people who know a lot more than I, the writer. And that's a fair way of putting it. This is why when you research as a writer, whether it's whatever medium you're exploring, you give enough to know so your reader knows they know something about it, but they don't have to micromanage that.
Yeah, absolutely.
John, do you have some thoughts?
Oh yeah. Well, give them enough that they enjoy being engaged and they think that that's a legitimate thing in your world. I think on other shows we talked about the rabbit hole of research.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really need to develop, a quantum canon or whatever. You can just say that there's a quantum canon and move on from it.
But if you add 1 to 3 details about it, not 3 pages, then it says, oh, this person knows something about it, but it leaves it vague enough. People who know more go, I recognize these points and I can work with this. I'm not pulled out of the story because I know more than them. And somebody who is new to it isn't lost in minutia and detail they don't give a damn about. Michael Crichton's really good at this, where he gives you, here's this science, but you don't get lost in it or overwhelmed by it. He's just like, here's enough that you feel like you know what you're reading about, and then move on.
And to that point, I mean, like, talking about my sports career and stuff, they don't care that I know technically how to do a 3-point stance and all that other type of stuff. They care about how sweaty and muddy and all the other things that are going on. Not that. Yeah.
But you can mention the 3-point stance and they can research it if they want, or somebody who knows what it means, it says something and fills in extra details for them.
Yeah. And that's not to, so I think we might be giving the impression that world building is not important.
Oh, it is, yeah.
It's very important. I think what we're saying is focusing on just world building to the exclusion of everything else is a bad move. World building is important. You do, as an author, need to know what the world is that your characters are experiencing, and you need to do your best to make it consistent. Like, if I've said a character always wears blue socks, and 4 chapters later they're in green socks, either I forgot my own world, or there's a reason they're in green socks, and you need to give that to your audience. So world building is important to the point of, you got to create a cool world, you got to create a believable world that your characters live in, and you've got to remember the details that you set down. I think one of our commenters said you give too many details, and then you get people like the comic book fans and the Star Trek fans but say, oh, but wait a second, in episode 12 they did that, and that's not consistent with what you're doing today. You don't want to dig that hole, but you do want to create an interesting world.
Those are articles I see once in a while. Star Trek Discovery broke this one canon rule, and I'm like, I don't even want to read the article really, because I don't care. I've watched what they're talking about, and I'm curious what they mean. And every time I read the article, I'm like, who cares? Yeah. It's a new part of the world. Let's move on. Quit crying. It's not like they suddenly said.
Well, to that point, comic books specifically, people complain that the movie wasn't like the comic. Well, which version of the comic, since they reinvented it 40 times prior to?
Right.
And did you like what the director did in the movie?
Right.
Minus whatever else out there, did you enjoy the movie?
So on those lines, I don't know who here is old. Obviously, we're all old enough to have gone and seen the Lord of the Rings movies in the theater. I made the horrible mistake of rereading the second book, and I finished it the night before we went to watch the second movie.
Yeah.
And I did not like the movie because the book was fresh in my head, and I was noticing how they deviated or cut things out from the story that I thought should be there. Upon rewatching it, I think it's a great movie. So yeah, I mean, that's certainly there. Looking at, did they tell a good story? Was the story internally consistent? Did you enjoy the ride? If you go into things without those expectations, you're going to have a better experience.
Here's something I've started doing, Robert. I started decades ago. I realize this same problem. If I read a book and go see a movie, because I used to do that, I'm like, nope, here's what I'll do. For now on, I'm going to watch the movie and then read the book or reread the book afterwards, because then it fills in extra things. Instead of feeling like you're shorted, you feel like you're getting more out of the deal because the book expands on things movies never can.
Right.
Internalization, description, etc. And yeah, some people complain, well, then I have the actor in my head as that character when I'm reading the book. Well,
Yeah.
there's pros and cons on both sides here.
Right.
And we're all pretty fortunate that we're not writing like Star Wars trilogies for our world building and stuff. We're particularly lucky in that we have a comic book associated with the role playing game, and so you can see some of hopefully the consistency and stuff will stay there.
Right. But yeah, when you have especially different medias with the same world or product, there's going to be somebody that picks it apart and complains about it, because that's the joy. They find joy in complaining, and that's what they do.
And that's the thing. Why are you listening to the people that are looking to not like your product to start with? I mean, that's just, write a good story, as Robert said, and you move on.
So, along these lines, on world building, the role-playing game that I'm working on right now, Gablonia, is based, or was originally based, in the world of Ganner Snitch the Goblin. A character I played at festivals, had a stage show, would tell stories, eventually went on to write 2 books of his stories. Early in the past year, when we got back to playtesting this, I had some players that had read the books, knew the character, loved him, and I had some that had never read the books and had no idea who this character was. And I made a point of saying, this is not the Ganner Snitch the Goblin role-playing game. Ganner Snitch the Goblin is not in the story of this game. He will never show up. He's not a character in this game. But I did have one player who I really, really liked. He's a super fan of mine. And he, at certain points, brought up, well, but this is different than the book. And the role-playing game is not following the same rules as the book. And it bugged me at first. I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. We've got to change that in the game to match the book. And then I switched it. And I said, you know what? Ganner Snitch the Goblin is an unreliable character telling his version of events. You don't have to assume that he told the truth. And I don't want people to have read the books to play this game. So the world in the game is the consistent world. The stories that one of the characters told, those were stories that character told. And your games, you play at your own table, don't have to be those stories. They don't even have to be the same kind of stories.
How many times have we read a book and it has, whether it's the protagonist and the antagonist point of view, or 2 of the main protagonist views, and they're walking side by side, but they kind of go over the same scene or continue the scene in the other person's point of view, and it's a totally different perception of the same situation, because you internalize with that character's journey or experience or perception, and it's all about them, and they see the world differently than the other characters. And it's real. If we all talk about our experience tonight recording this podcast, we're each walking away with different things that the others might have not even registered or cared about.
And for us, and for Conquest in particular, the comics and stuff are enhancements for the role-playing game, not the Bible for it.
Yeah, it's one perception, one experience of it, not the whole world. And of course, if you're doing good character development, they're going to have their own twisted point of view that's unique to them, different from everybody else, as it should be, as we all do in everyday world. I feel like Robert's writing cue cards right now.
And I would definitely always love for
Go do it.
People that play the game or get engaged with it to engage with our website and stuff and tell us about their gaming experience and stuff with it. This is my homebrew. This is what we're doing in your world. That's just something, down the road I'd love to see happen.
I agree. So, we've got about 10 minutes left here. We've kind of gone over our whole thought process of how you begin world building and how you expand world building. But let's try to, I don't know, summarize it. Again, that concept, if somebody walks up to you and goes, I want to create a world, whether they have characters or not, how do they start? And my advice always is start where the characters are, build outward. If you know they're going somewhere else, having a little bit designed or set up so when they move into it, you're not moving in blind. But on the other hand, sometimes it's so fun to move in blind and then clean it up in the edit to create that consistency and smooth out those rough edges.
Yeah.
Robert, what about you?
So I actually get this a lot at conventions. As an author and game designer there, talking to people and wanting to be nice, I'll get a lot of people that will start to tell me about their world or their campaign. And I'll let them go on for a minute or two, especially if there's nobody else around, and then I'll stop them. And I'll say, that's great. That's awesome that you know that. Now tell me a story. I don't want to know about your world. I don't want to know about your campaign. I don't want to know why, or I don't want to know that elves are only 3 feet tall. I want to know why elves are only 3 feet tall, and I want to know the story of what happened with that 3 foot tall elf.
Right.
I don't want to know your world building. I want to know your interesting story. And that's what your readers are going to want. That's what your players are going to want. They're not going to care about all the details of your world. They're going to want to read a story.
John?
So with us, I mean, typically they'll come up and they'll say, I have this vision or I have this picture. The problem with a picture is it has frames around it and you can only go so far with it. That's not a story. That is a focus point of a section of time. So for your world building, broad brushstrokes, tell us what the story is, where characters are going to interact with, and that sets the tempo for, particularly where you're going to be. And as we touched on before, the stuff that's minutia, that's for you to add into your next adventure or when you're writing things within your system. That's stuff that you can put in your Bible for later on to add more to your particular game.
Right.
Or whatever. So add modules.
Here's something that crossed my mind
Modules
here.
and game systems aren't the same.
Very true. Something that just crossed my mind is world building should drive your story, and your story should drive your world building. It's a symbiotic relationship. And you can lean towards designing more of one or the other, but they have to blend together and help each other, or hinder each other, but create an interaction between one and the other. Thoughts on that?
Sure.
I mean, and they are symbiotic. I mean, I guess that's the part of projected as a prologue to your novel or to your role-playing game. I mean, they both kind of fit together. This is the template that everybody's sitting in. I mean, this is your world. So, but your players have to know what that is, and they have to like it. I mean, it's just as simple as that.
Robert?
So I think maybe, now that I've thought about it, actually I was writing down notes over here for Gablonia as John, or you would say something. I'm like, oh, that needs to be in the book. I need to nail that point in the intro. I think the best worlds are worlds that I want to visit as a reader, but I don't want to live there.
That's a good point.
I think those are the most interesting stories. Like I would love to visit Star Wars. I don't want to live in Star Wars. All right? I would love to visit the world of the Expanse and see all these cool spaceships and the ring gates. I don't want to live in those conditions. Visiting the world of Harry Potter, even. would be cool, but I don't want to live in the middle of a war between dark wizards and good wizards. So I think making your world an interesting place that supports your story, where you would want to go and visit, but not live there.
Let's Go to Work is not a good role-playing game.
Right.
That's something with Discworld I'm noticing
Right.
that I don't know even I picked it up when I was younger. It is a crime-riddled world where crime is legalized, and you have these characters, these pinpoints of story and light, who are trying to change that and almost fix that without knowing. They don't necessarily have our society in mind or anything like that. They just know this is not quite right. And you also have, things like your not unwilling hero, what's it called? Reluctant hero, I guess is a better phrase, but where they're just kind of tossed in and they're doing what they do in their nature.
Right.
But because of that, they're actually trying to make the world a better place. Without ever, that's not their goal, but it's what they're achieving by doing what comes natural to them, which might actually be criminal in nature and action compared to our world, but is trying to make their world a better place. And that's very endearing in that world. It's okay.
Well, and part of your world building helps somewhat have goals and stuff eventually for the characters and stuff.
Oh yeah. I always say with your story always should be epic. Whether it's to one character, it should be world changing. Whether that's to one character's personal world or, like Marvel, the whole universe when it came down to Thanos in the final phases, right? But even your smallest story, even if you're in a romantic comedy, it is still world-changing for that one character. It changes their world.
Yep.
And that's all part of world building and interweaving those characters with the environment and everything that's happening around them. Okay, closing thoughts, and then we'll do the wrap-up here.
And well, for my thing is, don't be different, be good. Write a good story. Don't worry about being unique.
Something we've said before in other
Make
broadcasts.
a good story and a good game.
Robert?
Don't let your... let me rephrase that, because I hate telling people what not to do. Let your story drive your world building. Make sure that your story is first and foremost in your mind, and fill in the blanks that you feel need to be fleshed out, but move on with your story.
To build on Robert's thought there is, let your story change your world also. Don't be afraid. Don't make your world have to stay exactly like it was when you started. Allow your characters to change that world. Allow your story to change that world. That will mean so much more to your players, your viewers, your fans, your readers, or whoever, when they saw this one person changed the world, even in some small way. And that's very important. Don't let your world building overshadow everything else. Okay, say goodbye to everybody, and I'll do the outro. We'll call it done.
Bye.
Okay.
Happy writing.
Thanks.
Before we go, I want to remind everyone that you can email us at rightnightshow@gmail.com. That's right with the W, night with an N, show@gmail.com. To let us know your thoughts on the show's topic, suggest other topics you'd like to hear us discuss, or just have a message read out on air to someone in your life. Thanks to everyone for supporting the show by downloading the podcast, sharing it on social media, grabbing some shirt stickers and mugs from bit.ly/tavern merch, or barware patches and hats from bit.ly/tavern merch too. It's bit.ly/tavern merch or tavern merch followed by the number 2. Thanks to everyone who joined us live at twitch.tv/Travis Tavern Talk, and everyone who supports the tavern by subscribing, hosting, throwing bits, raids, and most of all, commenting.
Thank you for joining author Travis I. Sivart and the other writers, content creators, and all-around amazing people for our discussion here on Right Night. Join us again soon, and until you do, make sure you create with passion, enjoy the journey, and remember, every night can be right enough.
Okay, we're out.
Woohoo!
Karen feeding a John's head. Literally or literal? Yeah. Anyhow, guys, thank you so much. Wordwin, Raven, Sari. Who else am I missing that jumped in? Kitty.
Kidding. Yeah.
And
everybody that was commenting and
yeah.
asking questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys understanding I can't read everything off because we would have so been another 20 minutes just on steampunk if I did. And we didn't want to do that. But, see, we could go into 20 minutes just about Star Trek.
Kitty, draw some pictures.
We have to have another episode of why steampunk sucks. We'll just do that one.
Oh, that is...
Wait a second.
Well, no, there's you could do that and still support steampunk at the same time by going, we don't need the minutia of every time somebody wears a pair of goggles to
what those goggles do.
Right. It's there is one time in one of my stories where I mentioned, a lot of people wore them for fashion. This guy wore them because he actually had a functional purpose. And that's it. Yeah, pretty much, because you're moving out on the open plains or whatever. Yeah. But Robert, we could do this when we're off air, but I need to see if I can tag you for one more thing with you and Tara. Right, this is why I'm going to lean more on your schedule instead of telling you. I'm going to be asking, are you available? And if not, I will get somebody else in there with Tara. Don't scratch on that. Whatever you're scratching on.
Not scratching on anything.
Whatever. I agree, Kitty. I think we all agree with that. I love steampunk. It's just that there's too many people who overthink. Yeah. It's and the minutia of describing how electricity works in a world that it's new to. There's ways you can convey that idea without going into. Anyhow.
I'm kidding as I type these comments. I don't anymore, but for a while there I was performing and vending at steampunk conventions. So I do actually enjoy steampunk.
Absolutely.
I just don't like it.
Same here. Well, there's a reason I'm writing other things now. But I still do have a special soft, mushy brown